Focusing the lens on the unseen and crossing the lines of traditional history, we reveal what truly happened. Experience an in-depth look at the precise moments that shifted our reality completely.
License and registration.
May I ask why I've been stopped?
License and registration,
Okay,
now.
I'm reaching for my credentials. I'm a diplomatic officer.
Where'd you get these?
They were issued to me by my government and by your State Department.
These look
I
fake.
assure you they are not fake. You can verify my identity with the South African Embassy or with...
ICE agents Vernon Mackey and Trevor Ramsey were conducting patrols in the Old Town Alexandria area of Virginia on the evening of April 18, 2025, when they spotted a black man in his 50s driving a Mercedes S-Class with diplomatic plates and decided that something about the situation didn't look right. They pulled him over on King Street, accused him of driving a stolen vehicle, refused to believe his credentials were legitimate, and handcuffed him on the side of the road while traffic slowed to watch the spectacle. What agents Mackey and Ramsey didn't know was that the man they just detained was Ambassador Mandla Nkosi, South Africa's ambassador to the United States. That diplomatic immunity meant they just violated international law, and that their racist assumptions were about to create a diplomatic crisis that would end their careers and land them in federal prison. This one is going to shock you. Hit that like button and subscribe to JPTV because this story gets absolutely wild. Old Town Alexandria is one of Northern Virginia's most historic and affluent neighborhoods, where brick sidewalks line cobblestone streets that date back to the colonial era and waterfront townhouses sell for millions of dollars. King Street runs straight through the heart of it, connecting the Potomac River waterfront to the metro station a mile inland, lined with upscale restaurants, art galleries, and the kind of boutique shops where diplomatic families do their shopping. The area sits just across the river from Washington, D.C., close enough that senior government officials, lobbyists, and foreign diplomats choose to live there for the proximity to the capital, combined with the charm of a smaller historic city. Ambassador Mandla Nkosi had maintained a residence in Old Town for 2.5 years, in a federal-style townhouse on Prince Street owned by the South African government, a property that had served as diplomatic housing since the early 2000s. He was 59 years old, a career diplomat who'd represented his country across 3 continents over a span of 33 years. He'd been appointed South Africa's ambassador to the United States in late 2022, coming to the position after serving as his country's permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva. He was known in Washington's diplomatic circles as intelligent, measured, and effective at building relationships across political divides. On the evening of April 18th, he was driving home from a dinner at the residence of the Nigerian ambassador in the Kalorama neighborhood of D.C., about a 20-minute drive back to Old Town through familiar routes he traveled dozens of times. He was alone in his vehicle, a black Mercedes S-Class from the South African Embassy's motor pool. The car carried distinctive diplomatic license plates issued by the U.S. State Department, marked with the letter D and a number sequence that identified it as belonging to an ambassador-level diplomat with full immunity under international law. He wore a charcoal suit with a silver tie, the formal attire appropriate for the diplomatic dinner he'd just attended, and he was thinking about a conversation he'd had with the Tanzanian ambassador about coordinating their country's positions on an upcoming UN vote when he noticed the unmarked SUV behind him activate its flashing lights. Mandla checked his mirrors and his speedometer instinctively. He'd been traveling at perhaps 28 miles per hour on King Street, well below the posted limit. He looked at the diplomatic plates mounted on his vehicle, clearly visible even in the darkness, and wondered if perhaps there was some emergency requiring the vehicle behind him to pass. But the SUV stayed directly behind him, lights pulsing, obviously signaling him to pull over. He activated his turn signal and pulled to the curb near the intersection of King Street and Columbus Street, in front of a row of historic buildings that housed restaurants with outdoor seating where diners were finishing their meals. He shifted into park, kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, and waited to see what this was about. 2 men exited the SUV wearing tactical vests marked ICE in large white letters across the front and back. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Mandla's confusion deepened immediately. ICE didn't conduct routine traffic stops, and they certainly didn't stop vehicles carrying diplomatic plates. There were established protocols for any law enforcement interaction with diplomatic personnel, protocols that ran through the State Department's Office of Foreign Missions to ensure compliance with international law. The first agent approaching was white, approximately 40 years old, with a military haircut and the muscular build of someone who prioritized physical fitness. His name tag identified him as Mackey. The second agent remained near the passenger side of the Mercedes, younger and leaner, his tag showing Ramsey. Both men had positioned their hands near their sidearms. Mandla lowered his window and addressed them with the calm professionalism he'd developed through decades of diplomatic service. "Good evening. May I ask what this is regarding?" "License and registration," Mackey stated. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. "Certainly," Mandla said, maintaining his polite tone despite the agent's curtness. "May I first ask why you've stopped me? I wasn't aware of any traffic violation." "License and registration, now." Mackey's voice had hardened on the second request. Mandla reached carefully into his suit jacket's interior pocket, moving deliberately and keeping his actions visible. "I'm retrieving my diplomatic credentials. I'm a diplomatic official with the South African government." He withdrew a leather credential holder and extended it through the window. Inside were his diplomatic passport, his official identification from the South African Embassy, and his credentials from the U.S. State Department, formally recognizing him as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of South Africa to the United States of America. Mackey accepted the holder and opened it. He examined the contents for perhaps 5 seconds, his eyes moving between the documents and Mandla's face, then back to the documents again. His expression remained hard and skeptical. "Where did you obtain these documents?" Mackey asked. Mandla blinked, uncertain he'd heard the question correctly. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "These documents, where did you get them?" "They were issued to me by the government of South Africa and authenticated by your State Department," Mandla explained patiently. "I am South Africa's ambassador to the United States. Those are my official diplomatic credentials." Mackey handed the credential holder to Ramsey, who had moved closer to examine them. Ramsey studied the documents with obvious suspicion written across his face. "These appear fraudulent," Ramsey stated flatly. Mandla felt the first stirring of genuine concern. "I can assure you with complete certainty that they are authentic. You can verify my identity and status through the South African Embassy or through the State Department's Office of Foreign Missions. The contact information is included on the credential card itself." "Explain how you came into possession of this vehicle," Mackey said, shifting his attention to the Mercedes, as though the car itself was evidence of criminal activity. "This vehicle is property of the South African Embassy," Mandla said, gesturing slightly toward the diplomatic plates, "as the license plates clearly indicate." "Diplomatic plates can't be stolen," Mackey said, "or counterfeited." Mandla looked at both agents, trying to process what was unfolding. "Officer, I believe there's been some fundamental misunderstanding. I am an accredited ambassador to your country. I possess full diplomatic immunity under the Vienna Convention. You can verify everything I'm telling you with a single phone call to the appropriate authorities." "Exit the vehicle," Mackey commanded. "I would prefer not to," Mandla said, keeping his voice measured but adding firmness. "As a credentialed diplomat, I am not subject to detention or search under international law. If there is some concern that requires addressing, it should be processed through established diplomatic channels." "Exit the vehicle immediately," Mackey repeated, his hand moving deliberately toward his weapon, "or I will physically remove you." Mandla studied both agents' faces, observed the suspicion and certainty in their expressions, and understood with a sinking feeling exactly what was occurring. They had seen a black man with an accent driving an expensive vehicle, and their prejudices had prevented them from seeing anything beyond that initial perception. He opened the door slowly and stepped onto the street, ensuring his hands remained visible at all times. "I am formally requesting that you contact the State Department without delay. What you are doing constitutes a violation of international law." "Place your hands behind your back," Mackey instructed. "You do not have authority to arrest me," Mandla said, his voice still controlled but now carrying an edge of steel. "I possess diplomatic immunity." "Hands behind your back," Mackey repeated. Mandla complied, and Mackey secured handcuffs around his wrists. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe that diplomatic immunity exists for a reason and no badge gives anyone the right to violate international law, then hit that like and subscribe button and join the JPTV family. The handcuffs were tight around Manla's wrists, metal pressing into his skin beneath the sleeves of his tailored suit. He stood on the brick sidewalk on King Street with his hands restrained behind his back, while diners at the nearby restaurant patio stopped their conversations and pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Traffic began to slow as drivers noticed a well-dressed man in handcuffs being detained by federal agents in the middle of Old Town Alexandria. This is violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, Manla said calmly, turning his head to look at Mackey. You are creating an international incident. What I'm doing is enforcing federal law, Mackey said. He walked around the Mercedes, peering through the windows, examining the diplomatic plates as if searching for evidence they were counterfeit. Ramsey was still studying Manla's credentials under the streetlight, turning the pages of the diplomatic passport, holding the embassy identification card up to examine the seal and photograph. These could be high-quality forgeries. We've seen sophisticated fakes before. They are not forgeries, Mandla said, his patience beginning to wear thin, despite his training in maintaining composure. Contact the State Department. Contact the South African Embassy. The embassy is located on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, less than 10 miles from this location. Someone can arrive here within 15 minutes to verify my identity. We don't need anyone to verify anything, Mackey said, returning to stand in front of Manla. We have a suspected stolen vehicle, suspected forged diplomatic credentials, and a foreign national who cannot adequately prove his legal status in this country. I am an ambassador, Manla said, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. I have demonstrated my legal status. I have presented credentials that clearly identify me as a diplomat with full immunity under international law. What you are doing at this moment is illegal under both domestic law and international treaty. Where are you originally from? Mackey asked, stepping closer and adopting an interrogative posture. I am from the Republic of South Africa, Manla said, as my credentials explicitly state, as my diplomatic passport clearly shows, as the license plates on that vehicle plainly indicate. How did you enter the United States? Ramsey asked from behind him. Manla turned to face him, his expression showing disbelief at the question. I entered on a diplomatic visa 3 years ago, when I was appointed to my current position as ambassador. All documentation related to my entry and status is registered with your State Department's Office of Foreign Missions. You have documentation proving you're legally present in this country? Mackey pressed. Yes, Manla said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. Everything is documented. My visa status, my diplomatic accreditation, my official residence, all of it. Every aspect of my presence here is properly registered with the appropriate authorities at the State Department. You can verify any and all of this information within minutes if you would simply place a phone call. We'll verify it at the processing facility, Mackey said. He reached for his radio. This is Unit 12. I need transportation to the detention center. I have one subject in custody, suspected immigration violations, and possession of fraudulent government documents. You cannot transport me to a detention facility, Manla said, and for the first time his diplomatic composure showed visible cracks. I am a diplomat. I cannot be arrested. I cannot be detained. This is a fundamental principle of international law that your government has agreed to respect and uphold. You're not a diplomat, Mackey said flatly. You're someone pretending to be a diplomat with sophisticated forgeries. Manla looked at both agents, at the absolute certainty on their faces, the complete refusal to even consider the possibility that they might be mistaken. He understood now that the situation would not be resolved on this street corner. These men had formed their conclusion the moment they saw him, and nothing he said would alter their perception. He managed to extract his phone from his jacket pocket with difficulty given his hands were restrained behind him. Ramsey immediately stepped forward and seized it from his grasp. I am entitled to make a phone call, Mandla said. You'll receive your phone call after you've been processed, Ramsey said, placing the phone in his own pocket. Under the Vienna Convention, I have the right to contact my embassy immediately, Mandla stated. You are legally required to permit me to do so. Stop citing this Vienna whatever convention, Mackey said dismissively. You're not a diplomat. You're under arrest for immigration violations. A marked police cruiser from the Alexandria Police Department pulled up to the scene, drawn by the commotion. An officer stepped out and surveyed the situation, taking in the diplomatic plates on the Mercedes, then Mandla in handcuffs, then the ICE agents. What's the situation here? The Alexandria officer asked. Federal immigration enforcement action, Mackey said. We have it under control. The Alexandria officer looked at the diplomatic plates again, then at Mandla with growing concern. Sir, are you diplomatic personnel? Yes, Mandla said immediately, relief flooding his voice. I am Ambassador Mandla Nkosi, the South African ambassador to the United States. These agents have detained me unlawfully. I need you to contact the State Department and the South African embassy immediately. The Alexandria officer's expression changed dramatically. He looked at Mackey with an expression that conveyed he recognized this was rapidly becoming a serious problem. He has diplomatic plates on his vehicle. If he's claiming to be an ambassador, you need to verify that status before taking any further action. We're in the process of verifying, Mackey said dismissively. We're transporting him for processing. That's not the correct protocol, the Alexandria officer said. Diplomatic immunity means you cannot simply arrest someone. You need to follow State Department procedures. He's carrying forged credentials, Ramsey said, holding up Mandla's documents. We believe the plates are stolen or counterfeit. The Alexandria officer took the credentials and examined them carefully. He studied the official seals, the signatures, the State Department authentication. His expression shifted from concern to alarmed. These appear genuine to me, the Alexandria officer said quietly. And if they are genuine, you two just handcuffed a foreign ambassador. They're sophisticated fakes, Mackey insisted. Then verify that with the State Department right now, the Alexandria officer said firmly. Immediately, before this situation deteriorates further. Mackey's jaw tightened, but he made no move to reach for his phone or radio. He stood on the sidewalk with Mandla in handcuffs and an Alexandria police officer telling him he'd made a critical error, and he still refused to acknowledge the possibility that he was wrong. That's when the first embassy vehicle arrived, followed moments later by a State Department car bearing government plates. The individuals who emerged were already moving with urgency, their faces showing they understood exactly what had occurred and how severe the consequences were about to become. The first person to exit the South African embassy vehicle was a woman in her late 40s named Thandiwe Khumalo, the embassy's deputy chief of mission. She took one look at Ambassador Nkosi standing on King Street in handcuffs, and her face transformed from professional concern to barely restrained fury. Behind her, two additional embassy staff members emerged, already documenting everything with their phones and cameras. From the State Department vehicle came a man in a dark suit with credentials identifying him as Diplomatic Security Service. His name was Maxwell Cross, and he'd spent 16 years protecting diplomatic personnel and enforcing protocols. He'd received an urgent call 12 minutes ago from someone at the South African embassy reporting that their ambassador had been detained by ICE on King Street, and he'd violated multiple traffic laws getting here from Washington. Who's in charge of this situation? Cross demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. Mackey stepped forward. I am ICE agent Vernon Mackey. We've detained a subject with suspected fraudulent diplomatic. Remove those handcuffs from him immediately, Cross interrupted, his voice going ice cold. He's carrying forged credentials, Mackey said. We're in the process of transporting him for... I said remove the handcuffs from him immediately, Cross repeated, his voice rising. That is Ambassador Mandla Nkosi. He is the accredited ambassador of the Republic of South Africa to the United States. Those credentials are authentic. That vehicle is registered to the South African embassy, and you have just committed a violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. Mackey's confident expression began to crack. The credentials appeared to be... Thandiwe stepped forward, her voice shaking with controlled rage. Ambassador Nkosi, have you sustained any injuries? I have not been injured, Mandla said quietly, but I would appreciate having these restraints removed. Cross turned to Mackey and extended his hand. The keys, right now. Mackey fumbled for his handcuff keys with trembling hands and surrendered them. Cross moved behind Mandla and unlocked the cuffs. They fell away and Mandla brought his hands forward, rubbing his wrists where deep red impressions had formed in his skin. Thandiwe immediately photographed the marks. We are documenting every aspect of this incident for the formal diplomatic protest we will be filing with the State Department. The Alexandria police officer who had tried to intervene earlier stepped back, clearly wanting distance from what was unfolding. Ramsey had gone completely pale and silent, standing frozen near the Mercedes. Mackey stood watching as the reality of what he'd done crashed over him in visible waves. We were simply performing our duties, Mackey said weakly. The plates looked suspicious and... Diplomatic plates look suspicious to you? Cross said, his voice dripping with contempt. You stopped a vehicle bearing clearly marked diplomatic plates, detained an ambassador who presented you with valid credentials, refused to verify his status through established channels, and handcuffed him on a public street. Do you comprehend what you've done? Mackey had no response. Thandiwe was on her phone speaking rapidly. Yes, Minister, he is here with us now. He is unharmed. They handcuffed him on King Street in full public view. She listened briefly. Yes, we are documenting everything thoroughly. State Department diplomatic security is on scene. She looked at Mackey with eyes like frozen steel. The foreign minister is asking for the names of the agents responsible. Vernon Mackey and Trevor Ramsey, Cross said, photographing both agents' name tags and badge numbers with his phone. Both ICE. I'm submitting my incident report tonight. Mandla finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. Gentlemen, what transpired here tonight was not a simple error in judgment. You stopped a diplomatic vehicle. You detained an accredited ambassador. You violated international law that has existed for over 6 decades. And you did all of this because you observed a black man driving an expensive automobile and could not conceive of a scenario in which he legitimately belonged there. That's not what, Mackey began. Do not compound your offense by denying the obvious, Mandla said, his voice becoming colder. I presented you with my credentials. I identified myself clearly. I requested multiple times that you verify my identity through appropriate channels. You refused every single request. You made your determination about who I was before you even approached my vehicle. A news van pulled up, having monitored police scanner traffic reporting a diplomatic incident in Old Town. A reporter and camera operator emerged and began recording. This would be on the evening news within the hour. Cross turned to both ICE agents. You are finished, not suspended pending investigation? Finished. The State Department will be filing formal complaints with the Department of Homeland Security. The South African government will be submitting a diplomatic protest, and I will personally be recommending federal criminal charges for violation of statutes protecting diplomatic personnel. Mackey looked at Ramsey, whose face showed he understood their careers had just ended on a street corner in Alexandria. Neither agent spoke. Manley walked to his Mercedes, retrieved his phone from Ramsey without requesting permission, and settled into the driver's seat. Thandiwe approached through the open window. Ambassador, we should escort you back to the embassy. You should not be driving after experiencing this. I appreciate your concern, Mandla said quietly. I will see you at the embassy tomorrow morning to discuss our formal response to this incident. He started the vehicle and departed, leaving the 2 ICE agents standing on King Street watching their entire futures collapse in real time around them. Vernon Mackey and Trevor Ramsey were placed on immediate administrative leave before they even returned to their field office that night. By the time they reached the ICE facility in Arlington, their supervisor had already received emergency calls from 4 different federal agencies, informing him what his agents had done. They were separated into different rooms, their badges and firearms were confiscated, and they were instructed to leave immediately and await further contact. The diplomatic explosion began within hours. The South African embassy filed a formal diplomatic protest with the U.S. State Department at 9 o'clock that evening. The document was devastating in its detail. The unlawful traffic stop without cause, the detention of Ambassador Nkosi in direct violation of his diplomatic immunity, The agent's refusal to verify his credentials through proper channels, the handcuffing and public humiliation, and the clear evidence of racial profiling. The protest was transmitted simultaneously to the Secretary of State in Washington and to the Minister of International Relations in Pretoria. By sunrise, the story had detonated across international media. South African news outlets ran it as their lead story with headlines screaming, "SA ambassador handcuffed by U.S. agents in racist attack," and "Diplomatic immunity shattered in Virginia." The cell phone footage captured by witnesses on King Street showed everything in brutal clarity. A distinguished diplomat in an expensive suit standing in handcuffs while ICE agents treated him like a common criminal. The video exploded across social media, accumulating 10 million views within the first 12 hours. The U.S. State Department had no choice but to respond immediately. The Secretary of State personally telephoned the South African Foreign Minister before noon to express the government's profound regret and assure him this incident was receiving attention at the absolute highest levels. But apologies meant nothing without accountability, and South Africa wanted blood. Multiple investigations launched simultaneously. The Department of Homeland Security Inspector General opened a formal inquiry. The FBI initiated its own investigation because detaining a foreign diplomat without legal authority constitutes a federal crime under Title 18, Section 112 of the U.S. Code. The State Department's Office of Inspector General began reviewing what had happened and why ICE agents had been so catastrophically ignorant of diplomatic protocols. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Witness statements from a dozen people, video footage from multiple angles, the testimony of the Alexandria police officer who tried to stop the detention, Mackey and Ramsey's own incident reports, which only made things worse because they documented their actions in writing. Everything confirmed the same damning narrative. Mackey and Ramsey were terminated from ICE 7 weeks after the incident. Their termination letters cited gross negligence, failure to follow established diplomatic protocols, violation of international law, conduct that severely damaged United States foreign relations, and racial profiling. But losing their jobs was just the opening act. Federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against both agents 4 months later. The indictments included deprivation of civil rights under color of law and violation of protections afforded to foreign diplomatic personnel. The trial began 11 months after the incident and lasted 9 days. The prosecution's case was devastatingly simple. These agents saw a black man driving a luxury vehicle with diplomatic plates, concluded he must be a criminal despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and detained him in flagrant violation of clearly established law. The defense tried to argue the agents had acted in good faith based on their training and experience. The prosecution destroyed that argument by introducing evidence showing both agents had received specific training on diplomatic immunity and the Vienna Convention. They'd been taught exactly what diplomatic plates meant. They'd been instructed on proper verification procedures. They'd ignored all of it because their racist assumptions overrode their training. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on every count. Mackey received a sentence of 3 years in federal prison. Ramsey got 2 years. Both would carry felony convictions for the remainder of their lives. Ambassador Nkosi filed a civil lawsuit seeking $6 million in damages for violation of his rights, emotional distress, and harm to his reputation. The suit named both agents personally and the United States government for the actions of its employees. The government settled for $4.2 million before trial, paid entirely by American taxpayers, because 2 agents couldn't see past the color of someone's skin. Congress held explosive hearings. Senators from both parties expressed outrage that federal law enforcement could be so ignorant of basic diplomatic law in the nation's capital region where hundreds of diplomats lived and worked. Committee chairs demanded answers about ICE training, accountability mechanisms, and how this catastrophic failure had occurred. The hearings were televised and became national news for 3 consecutive days. ICE was forced to implement immediate sweeping reforms. Mandatory comprehensive training on diplomatic immunity, the Vienna Convention, and international protocols. New requirements for supervisory approval before any contact with vehicles bearing diplomatic plates. A direct emergency line to the State Department's Office of Foreign Missions for instant verification. Body-worn cameras made mandatory for all agents with strict prohibitions on deactivation. The reforms were named the Nkosi Protocols in official Department of Homeland Security documentation. The incident became required study material in every diplomatic training program globally. Law schools taught it as a case study in what happens when law enforcement violates international law. It appeared in every ICE training manual with the header, "Critical Failure, Violation of Diplomatic Immunity." Ambassador Nkosi continued representing South Africa in Washington with the same dignity and professionalism he'd always displayed. He met with cabinet members, negotiated bilateral agreements, attended state functions, and performed all his ambassadorial duties. But he carried the memory of standing handcuffed on King Street while strangers recorded his degradation. He used that experience to speak publicly about how racial profiling affects everyone regardless of status, credentials, or position. Vernon Mackey served every day of his 3-year sentence in a federal correctional institution in Kentucky. When he walked out, he was 43 years old with a destroyed career, a felony record, and a name permanently linked to international disgrace. He couldn't work in law enforcement anywhere. Government employment was impossible. His case became the textbook example of what racism in uniform costs. He ended up working night shifts at a warehouse in Tennessee for barely above minimum wage. The Mercedes S-Class that Mackey assumed was stolen still serves in the South African Embassy motor pool. Ambassador Nkosi occasionally drives it, though he now keeps multiple copies of his diplomatic credentials in various locations throughout the vehicle. Not because he believes it would prevent another incident, but because he learned that even being an ambassador offers no protection when someone looks at you and sees only what their prejudices tell them. The marks on his wrist from the handcuffs disappeared within a week. The violation of being treated like a criminal in a country where he represented his nation took far longer to heal. But heal it did, because Mandla Nkosi understood something these agents never would. Dignity cannot be taken away by handcuffs, only revealed by how you respond when they are applied. When racism violates international law and creates diplomatic crises, the consequences must shake the system to its core. If this story showed you why diplomatic immunity matters and why respecting it is non-negotiable, share it everywhere. Subscribe to JPTV because we're exposing injustice and demanding accountability, one explosive story at a time. Justice doesn't whisper, it detonates.
Human history is permanently written in the detailed records we leave behind, and each record tells a profound story of its own. Uncovering the objective truth within them is a deeply shared responsibility. Thank you for being an essential part of this meaningful exploration.